Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Well, the Republican Party is stuck with Donald Trump. They won't say that publicly, and they sure as heck didn't feel that way just 3 weeks ago when many Republicans were talking about, winning New Jersey in the presidential election, thinking about what jobs they would have in the second Trump administration. But a lot has changed since Kamala Harris replaced Joe Biden on the Democratic side of the ticket. Trump is now losing a race that he was pretty clearly winning before. And let's not overstate things. I mean, Trump is behind in the national polling average. He's behind in the key swing states. But all those leads are narrow. The race is still, because of the nature of American politics, close. And as we have just seen in the last 3 weeks, boy, things can change radically very quickly, can't they? But, I was thinking today, one of the themes of Nikki Haley's short-lived presidential campaign still rings kind of prescient. It was this.
Most Americans do not want a rematch between Biden and Trump. The first party to retire its 80-year-old candidate is going to be the party that wins this election.
Remember that line? I don't know why it floated into my head today. Some real insight there, gotta say. And it is transferred to what you see in the polls. Donald Trump is now the oldest man to run for a 4-year term as president. He is older today than Ronald Reagan was when Ronald Reagan left office. And Trump isn't new. He's not some novelty anymore. He has been doing the exact same shtick since 2015. He is also very obviously deteriorating in terms of his capacity, his capabilities, and his energy level. As we saw in his glitchy, rambling, difficult to understand audio conversation with Elon Musk last night, where he delivered important public policy messages to the American people like this.
Kamala wouldn't have this conversation. She can't because she's not smart. She's not a smart person, by the way. She can't have this conversation. And Biden, we don't even have to talk about it. I mean, he couldn't have this conversation. He would have given up on the first half of a question. He would have walked out.
That appearance, if you want to call it that, was the culmination of a 3-week stretch in which Trump still attacked Biden, even kind of weirdly wrote this fanfic about him coming back to the race. He's not running against him, just for the record. He also, over the weekend, spread this downright ludicrous and comical, at some level, conspiracy theory, falsely claiming the Harris campaign crowd sizes, which everyone saw with their own eyes, including the people who were there, had been completely fabricated using AI. He suggested that Kamala Harris only became a black person recently, which is a racist lie, but also weird, the product of a brain that's been scrambled like eggs. Donald Trump is the same guy he's always been, and yet Republicans, I mean, God bless him, still think he's capable of being someone else entirely. Now, I have to say, it's 2024, been doing this for a little bit. I have personally covered hundreds of new tone for Donald Trump news cycles over all these years. Most recently, we heard it after he survived a genuinely terrifying close call assassination attempt in Pennsylvania, and in the lead up to the RNC. We heard that he changed. He'd mellowed. He was all about unity. As one convention delegate told reporters, the real estate salesman, I think, is a different person. It's a good thing. Humility goes a long way in politics and attracts far more people. I think he's seeing God. Does that sound familiar? Haven't we been hearing this stuff for the better part of a decade?
He became president of the United States in that moment, period. He did something tonight that you cannot take away from him. He became president of the United States.
You saw that humanity, you saw that unity on display.
I think you're going to see a lot of reporters talking about the moment President Trump became presidential once again. It seems like with every serious address he does, we saw it with his first address to Congress last year, it's about how he acted.
7 years. We've been doing this for 7 years. At this point, it's like Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner. There's not a lot of narrative suspense about what's going to happen. Yet if you listen to what Republican insiders are still telling reporters, they want Trump to do a pivot. They want him to be more disciplined. They want him to be more presidential. And this time, it will be for real.
You've got to make this race not on personalities. Stop questioning the size of her crowds and start questioning her position when it comes to what did she do as Attorney General on crime.
Don't wander off. Don't call her stupid and all kinds of names. Stay on message. The winning formula for President Trump is very plain to see. It's fewer insults, more insights, and that policy contrast.
We can help our candidates at every level by speaking the truth to them respectfully. I have some familiarity with that. I did it for 4 years.
I almost got hanged for it, but I did keep it respectful. Mike Pence, of all people, should know you can't change Donald Trump. Yet people keep falling into the same old trap. Even the people who joined the Trump 2024 bandwagon at its peak, the people who bought the stock at its highest right after the convention. Some of them showed up to a Trump fundraiser earlier this month on Long Island, including billionaire hedge funders like Bill Ackman. According to the New York Times, at the dinner that evening, Harrison Lefrak, the scion of a New York real estate family whose father is an old friend of Mr. Trump's, asked how Mr. Trump planned to take the narrative back from Democrats, what his positive vision for the country would be. It appeared to be a request for reassurance. Mr. Trump provided none. Instead, he criticized Ms. Harris on a range of fronts before adding, "I am who I am." Say this for the guy, he has more self-awareness, more awareness about himself than a shocking number of people in Republican politics. He won't change. And you know who else understands this? The voters do. Like the ones in this focus group held after Trump's first joint address to Congress and the nation as president back in 2017. That was the one that pundits called so presidential.
That is no way the real Donald Trump.
No way.
Real Donald Trump will surface in probably less than 2 hours.
Let's focus on tonight. I think this is the Donald Trump needs to be, and the next thing he needs to do is delete his Twitter feed.
Absolutely. How many of you don't like what he does on Twitter? Raise your hands. How many of you voted for him and don't like what he does on Twitter?
Do you even have Twitter if you voted for him? Do you have Twitter? Because that's where you're going to see your real president. If you don't have Twitter, you cannot defend Donald Trump.
Probably worth mentioning here that in advance of last night's Twitter show with Musk, Donald Trump got back to posting on the site. That's the platform that he was kicked off on for inciting a deadly insurrection at the U.S. Capitol and attempting to end the American democratic experiment. Meanwhile, the Democrats, well, they got something new. They have an open horizon in front of them as they enter a convention united with a popular, energetic ticket, a messaging opportunity we have not seen in our lifetimes. The Republicans, they got the same horse they've been riding since 2015. Jamelle Bouie is an opinion columnist for the New York Times. His column today is titled, "What the Republican Party Might Look Like If Trump Loses." Don Favreau is a former head speechwriter for President Obama. He's a co-founder of Crooked Media, where he co-hosts the podcast Pod Save America, and they both join me now. Jamelle, there was a lot in that Times piece. The Hamptons, the scene at the Hamptons fundraiser with the rich folks being like, so what's the positive message here? And him being like, what are you talking about? I am who I am. I just thought, I don't know if like people are willfully blind to this or they're lying to themselves or lying to other reporters. But like, as you write in your column, he is who he is. We all know who he is.
Yeah, it's really bizarre to see people just consistently refuse to take Trump as he presents himself. I honestly find it so troubling almost that these ostensibly intelligent people would be like surprised by the fact that Trump doesn't have any secret plan to get positive. It's almost as if they are doing the exact same thing that I think a lot of voters did in 2016, which is assume that because Trump is rich and because he's on television and because people listen to him, therefore there must be something else there, when there just really isn't.
John, this was we found this. He was at a rally, I think, in Pennsylvania on July 31st, which, again, like, I don't think of him as a particularly self-aware person, but he can weirdly be sort of self-aware. And I think actually to the degree that he does have some genuine political talent, which he certainly does, it partly grows out of this strange self-referential. But this is what he had to say at a rally when he was telling people back then, like, I'm not doing the unity shtick. Take a listen.
You know, when I got hit, everybody thought I was going to be a nice guy. And they thought I changed. Remember, just before the Republican convention, they all said, Trump is going to be a nice man now. He came close to death. And I really agreed with that for about 8 hours or so. And then I realized they were trying to put me in prison for doing absolutely nothing wrong.
I mean, it's totally perfect.
I mean, he's true to who he is, right? He is angry. He is filled with grievance. I also think that he believes that an angry Trump is more effective and more true to his message than a nicer Trump who wants unity, because what he's trying to tell people is that the system is all screwed up, our institutions are broken, the country's a horrible place, and you need to be angry about that, and you need someone who's angry who's going to take the system down. So I think that he's always running in a Republican primary. That's his whole shtick, right? Like, he doesn't know how to reach out to moderate voters. He doesn't know how to reach out to the middle. He won in 2016 because he barely got the Republican Party, unified, and he got turnout up a little bit, and then he kept it close in 2020. But he's never really made a move in these last 7 years to win over undecided, persuadable voters. And so he thinks that the angry shtick is who he is, and he thinks it's going to work for him.
Our top story tonight is Kamala Harris's surge, Donald Trump's fear, and brand new developments fortifying the effort to make women's rights and choice a top ballot issue in some key states in November. I'm going to show you exactly how that's playing out in a moment, while the energy around the Harris campaign is manifesting itself in the big crowds, which are drawing Donald Trump's ire. One Detroit crowd was so large, so visually striking, that he is now lying about it with propaganda posts that I'm not going to quote or air tonight. Trump also is longing for the old days of 3 weeks ago. That's just some of her crowd lining up there, by the way, when Harris was not his opponent, drawing jokes about the matchup and Trump grieving the loss of whatever he viewed as an easier opponent.
I get it. You wanted to run against Joe Biden. Just two old dudes going toe-to-toe, fungus. A last hurrah, Rocky 12. It's not fair. Now you've got to run against someone who appears healthy and youthful and happy.
He's grieving for his lost lead against Joe Biden. He's going through all the Trump stages of grief. It goes anger, denial that you're angry, hanger, and nugget bucket.
The jokes relate to something true. Colbert's just riffing on the old psychological literature about the actual 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance, drawn from work by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross about 50 years ago. Now, many people can recognize how really bad news will spark things like denial or anger, and how a healthy landing place for major setbacks is usually an acceptance of reality, rather than staying in that denial phase, which could be your initial reaction or complete ongoing delusion. But Trump is weak when it comes to accepting tough realities. He lies constantly, that's documented. He lies most about truths that could hurt him politically, psychologically, or otherwise, and he is still lying about his 2020 loss, which linked to plots that have landed so many other people in prison, those lies with consequences. And in that sense, tonight we can tell you Donald Trump's lies can still be a tell. He doesn't lie about the election results he got in Texas, which he won twice. He lies about the things where he is losing or thinks he's losing or is on defense. And that, from the joke to the truth, teased up exactly how Trump and the Republican Party are falling further behind on reproductive rights and choice, which is now going to be on even more ballots this November. Now remember, a huge majority of Americans say abortion should be a decision made by a woman and her doctor, not by the government. And that's especially the case earlier in a pregnancy when you break out these numbers. And that includes, as you see there, most Republicans. Or take Florida, where this DeSantis Republican abortion ban is now up for voters' review in this November's election through another ballot initiative. Most voters, according to the polls in Florida, oppose it, including Republicans. That's a reality that Donald Trump clearly knows about. So this week, he tried to falsely downplay this issue of reproductive rights as somehow fading. And then, on the question in Florida, a big state where he lives, he literally refused to say where he stands on the Florida vote.
I think the abortion issue has been very much tempered down, and I've answered, I think, very well in the debate, and it seems to be much less of an issue. I'm going to announce that. I'm going to actually have a press conference on that at some point in the near future, so I don't want to tell you now. But Florida does have a vote coming up.
Yes, Florida does have a vote coming up. That's what they asked him about, that state measure, which, as he said, he wouldn't answer, and then talked about, hyping a future press conference, which is a distraction technique. If you know what you stand for and are willing to stand on it, to stand on your positions in campaign business, you do it. He did not. But we know Trump's position. He put the 3 judges on the Supreme Court who overturned abortion rights. So now trying to confuse people about his record or future announcements, I guess that's one political strategy on this issue. His party's current platform, which he's in charge of as the nominee, like Project 2025, though, already wrote down extreme anti-abortion plans. We have that. And that's even as Trump and his own aides still try to run from their own literally written out blueprints from the platform to Project 2025. This is a point that we pressed Trump White House veteran Stephen Miller on.
That Project 2025 has absolutely nothing to do with the past, present, or future. President Trump and President Trump alone will make his own policies.
There are issues where we see a kind of overlap. On abortion, a big issue. Project 2025 talks about cracking down on these abortion drugs. The current Republican platform talks about using the 14th Amendment to try to enshrine this sort of life test, as they call it, that would do similar things.
There will be no national abortion ban under a Trump administration.
That is the sound of one of Donald Trump's most loyal, long-serving, and quite conservative advisors running away from their record on reproductive rights. Now, it's up to voters to listen and decide what they believe. We are here gathering the evidence. But I am going to go through the evidence and the fact check, because it's the kind of claim you get from political people when they know a stance is unpopular. Trump and his new running mate already have the public and clear record opposing abortion access and going as far as calling for the criminal punishment of women for exercising what for many years had been a right. And by the way, many pro-life leaders oppose jailing women for this procedure, even if they separately don't think it should happen, precisely because it's so unpopular and, again, depending on the decade, unconstitutional.
Do you believe in punishment for abortion? Yes or no, as a principle?
The answer is that there has to be some form of punishment.
For the woman?
Yeah, there has to be some form.
I certainly would like abortion to be illegal nationally. Hopefully we get to a point where Ohio bans abortion and California and the Soroses of the world respect it.
I was able to terminate Roe v. Wade. I was so honored to have done it.
That's what he did. That was his position. And now he's basically trying to spin and swim away from that. But Donald Trump may be heading into a wave so big it overtakes anything he does. Even the best surfers find some waves are just too big to ride to take for a spin. And they are, as you'll see here, just overwhelmed. There it is. Just can't even ride it. Now, in real life, these waves are blue. Politically, it's more of a purple wave because states blue, purple, and red are all rejecting Donald Trump's abortion policy since Roe was ended. This is one of the largest bipartisan trends of our era. Trump faces this barrier-breaking nominee, a woman running on choice with this wind at her back. And the news tonight, just like those off-year elections where people voted for choice because it was on a state ballot, the news tonight is 2 more states will put abortion rights on their November ballots. This is big and follows the pattern. It includes the key swing state of Arizona and delegate-rich Missouri. Elections officials found that the activists pushing this qualified to get those issues on their ballot this November. So those states joined Florida with the state initiative that Trump says he won't announce a position on yet, for 8 total states with these confirmed abortion rights initiatives on your ballot if you live in these states this November. This does not look like an issue that Trump can just swim away from or lie away into the background. In those 8 states, it will be staring at voters when they literally go into the voting booth and see that, among other issues, and candidate names. And in these next 8 weeks leading up to those election days in all those various states, or whether you vote early, sooner than 8 weeks, voters will be seeing an alternative candidate, a different choice, an option. And she's not spinning or lying about her stance or past record. There's been much talk about what we've heard from Kamala Harris in these 3 weeks since she became the nominee. and what press she's doing or not and what events she's doing or not, but the record matters. I just showed you some of Trump and Vance's record. Now let's look at Harris's record. Before she was even the nominee, she had been on offense about reproductive rights.
So-called leaders are saying that after an individual has experienced such a crime of violence, a violation to their body, and surviving that these so-called leaders would say to that same person, and the next decision you make about your body is not yours either. That's immoral.
That is the moral position, and in her case, a consistent position on this major issue. Politics sometimes is about the crowds I mentioned. It's about the history. It's about all kinds of clashes, but sometimes it's about stuff that really matters to people's lives. You can watch Donald Trump's record there, and you can watch Harris's record, and you can see what you think they're saying, whether they seem to care, and what their consistency is. If you watch, of course, the ballot, which is the politics side, anyone who wants Democrats to win, even separate from this issue, thinks this is the wave, larger than many other waves, that could completely topple even a candidate who's been effective at spinning and lying his way through other waves.
It has been a remarkable 3 weeks for Kamala Harris, and it is not over. NBC News reports today that the Harris campaign is transforming its massive rally crowds into thousands of ground volunteers in key swing states. But it has also been a remarkable 3 weeks for Donald Trump, just not in a good way. According to recent reporting in the New York Times, Trump has been in a foul mood and complaining incessantly about having to start the race over again. The people around Mr. Trump, the Times reports, see a candidate knocked off his bearings. Joining me now are Kadia Goba, politics reporter for Semaphore, and MSNBC political analyst and former Democratic senator from Missouri, Claire McCaskill. Knocked off his bearings. Now, Kadia, I feel like the beginning of this spiral probably started at the National Association of Black Journalists Conference, the NABJ, where you were one of the interviewers who questioned former President Trump, and he gave his incoherent answer about Kamala Harris's racial identity. What was it like to see him beginning to be knocked off his bearings, and what do you make of the weeks that have ensued?
You know, it was very surprising because I just didn't expect that. You have to realize I had just interviewed Donald Trump in June, so a few weeks before that interview. So to hear him, you know, with this new attack line about Kamala Harris's race and her not identifying as a black person or a black woman, and, you know, now she's Indian, it was very surprising. But also all of the other rhetoric around, you know, the sound and everything else, and calling, you know, attacking essentially the interviewers. It wasn't, it was surprising because I feel like I haven't seen that since 2016 on the campaign anyway. And, you know, it was just, it hasn't tapered off. As you just mentioned, there are reports where he's been frustrated privately.
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't tapered off. And Claire, you know, by some accounts, Trump is even angrier than he was prior to the tragic assassination attempt. And yet the reports from inside Trumpland, according to NBC News, are when we're effectively able to put Biden's record on Harris, the polling's going to go back to what it was before. That's according to an outside advisor talking about the Trump campaign. And my question is, like, what do you make of the spiraling that's happening right now in Trump land and going back to what it was before? Do you think that can actually happen?
Well, I think you have to remember what Donald Trump is. He's a marketer. And he has succeeded in American politics by building what he sees as a brand, marketing himself as somehow on the side of your grievance, and getting attention, saying things that normal candidates wouldn't say, doing things that normal candidates wouldn't do. And when he did that, he got so much attention, so much earned media, because everyone was astounded that he would say and do the things he was doing. Now, all of a sudden, he has shrunk. He is no longer the BMOC. He is no longer the guy that everybody's talking about on TV. We're talking about him now, but really, if you look at the coverage over the last 3 weeks, it's been all Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. It's their crowds, not his crowds. It's their polling, not his polling. And what he does when he gets in that position, he gets angry and he gets even more crazy. He says even more crazy things like him and Vladimir Putin saying, way, no way. I mean, it's just, or that her crowds are AI generated. So I don't think this is going to get better. I think it's going to get worse. And I don't see anything event that's going to change the trajectory of this, because you can't change Donald Trump.
I'm also surprised, Claire, that, and I'm not surprised actually, he has been unable to sort of find his line of attack for Harris. And I think some of that is owed to the fact that his two previous opponents, Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, are known entities in American politics. And with Kamala Harris, he's dealing with someone that is not a cipher, but does not have decades of elected service on the national level. And he has not been able to land a punch at all. It really undermines the myth of him being some genius marketer that can, you know, sort of pin the tail on any politician that dares run against him.
He doesn't know how to run for anything, Alex. He's never had policies. He runs against everything. America sucks. You know, China sucks. Immigrants suck. Everybody, you know, calling people names. He is a negative guy. He knows that negative works. If you run down your opponent, if you run down the other guy's brand, then your brand emerges. And it's not working because people are looking at Kamala Harris. They're seeing someone who is smiling and happy and aspirational and hopeful. And they go, you know what? I kind of like that better than all the darkness, gloom, and doom that Donald Trump specializes in. I think he's got a real problem, and he still is so mad that he's not running against Joe Biden. He can't get over it.
It feels like there was a lot of reporting. We were talking a lot about communities of color and young voters, which were a problem for the Biden campaign. Though the Biden campaign would deny it, the polling showed that there was a real loss of support there, which it sounds like, or it seems like from the numbers we have now, Kamala Harris is making up dramatically, right? The New York Times Siena poll in the 3 battleground states that Democrats have to win, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, shows among black voters, Harris is getting 81% of the vote. Trump is getting 13. Among young voters, Biden's getting, I believe, 56%, or Harris is getting 56%. Trump is getting 41%. Can you talk to me a little bit about, the degree to which, A, this is surprising to you from your reporting, and B, to which you think this is fungible, whether that this is support that comes and goes, or whether you think this truly represents a turning of the tide?
Well, I think what you definitely see is a re-energized Democratic Party, right? We see some of the base coming back home. Some of them weren't, happy with the former candidate, Joe Biden. So I think you see some of that. That's where those numbers creep up and try and kind of tie with Donald Trump. But I will say that Republicans will float between 11 and 14% on a presidential election. And it's not surprising that Trump is at 13% right now. I think the race going forward will be chipping away at some of those black votes. I talk to people in the inner cities in New York and cities who have been, impacted by the migrant crisis. They're still a little on the fence about whether or not Kamala Harris has will have a policy that's different from Joe Biden. So, while she is gaining momentum, I still think there's work to do because Republicans see an opportunity, especially among black men.
Can we talk a little bit about her strategy going forward, Claire? Because I think there's some vague debate about the specificity with which she should campaign in terms of policy over the coming months. I should say 84 days. Do you have an opinion on that, whether there should be more policy or whether riding the vibe momentum, the extraordinary outpouring of grassroots enthusiasm is enough to get to Election Day?
Well, no one should confuse the enthusiasm for Kamala Harris for a lack of substance. She knows her stuff. She knows where this country needs to go. And I'm sure they will lay out these policy positions, and they will be available for people to look at on websites and think about and research. But she needs to be careful, because Democrats sometimes fall in the trap of thinking, well, if I can just give one more detail about how we are going to convert green energy into jobs, if I can just give them one more in the weeds factoid, that will do it. Keep in mind, Alex, the people who are going to decide this election are not high information voters. Many of them don't pay attention until the last 60 days of a campaign. So, yes, she has to have that substance ready to go, and she's got to answer questions about that substance. But she needs to keep her campaign where it is now in terms of, hey, we're not going back. We're going forward. And this is about you, and it's not about him. And those are the things that will convince those low information voters that, frankly, decide many, many close presidential elections.
Such a good point. Also, Donald Trump is leading a Republican Party with no decipherable platform whatsoever other than tax cuts for millionaires. Kadia Goba, Claire McCaskill, thank you both for being here. Really appreciate your time.
Got a lot of breaking news out of the Midwest tonight. The NBC News Decision Desk projects that Minnesota Congresswoman Ilhan Omar has won the Democratic primary for Minnesota's 5th district, 56% to 43% for her challenger, Don Samuels. Donald Trump's conversation with X's owner, Elon Musk, last night is just one of the ways that the tech billionaire is using the social media company to not only push his political views, but to spread misinformation about the upcoming election. Beside using his own account, his personal X account, to cast doubt on election machines, on mail-in ballots, and on legal voting, in addition to surfacing racist, anti-Semitic, and misogynistic comments and accounts, Elon Musk is being called out for X's AI chatbot spreading false information about the election and President Biden's decision not to run. After President Biden announced he would not seek re-election, the X search assistant wrongly told social media users that Vice President Kamala Harris had missed the ballot deadline in 9 states and wasn't eligible to appear on the ballot in those states in place of Biden. Vice President Harris and Donald Trump are both working to reach young voters, independent voters, undecided voters, many of whom are not entirely engaged in politics, some who may be voting for the first time and need reliable, accurate information on when and how to vote. One could imagine could be easily tuned out if they say we're wrongly told that their candidate isn't going to be on the ballot. Minnesota Secretary of State Steve Simon is spearheading an effort calling on Elon Musk to fix X's AI chatbot and provide accurate election information for its users. In a letter to Musk, he writes, quote, as tens of millions of voters in the United States seek basic information about voting in this major election year, X has the responsibility to ensure all voters using your platform have access to guidance that reflects true and accurate information about their constitutional right to vote. We urge X to immediately adopt a policy of directing AI chatbot users to canivote.org when asked about elections in the U.S. Joining us now is the Minnesota Secretary of State, Steve Simon. Secretary Simon, good to see you. Thank you for being with us this evening.
Thanks for having me.
Talk to me about this, because you're talking about the obligations that X should have as a platform. I think the last 7-8 years will have told us that these tech companies don't take those obligations all that seriously. But here, it's not just a technical problem. It's that Elon Musk himself spreads this disinformation. So how do you solve for that? Because it doesn't even seem like there's an intent to get things right.
Well, I would go even a step further. You know, you hear some of the social media companies, not just this one, but others saying, look, all we are is owners of a public square.
Yes.
And once in a while, someone's going to come in the public square and they're going to lie and they're going to deceive, and we can't really police that. That's what they say.
Yes.
But in this case, it's the owner of the public square and his own tool, the company's own tool, their chatbot. It's not someone in the square. It's the owners of the square. And that's the problem here. There are solutions. There are, as we said, and as you just summarized, there are ways that they can make this right. But The reason we, a bunch of secretaries, not just me, chose to speak up at this time is, look, who knows what the next error is going to be? This one was relatively low stakes. It's unlikely that someone will be disenfranchised if they believe wrongly what the rules are for ballot access for a candidate. But what if the next time they ask a question of this or any other AI chatbot, it's about whether they're eligible to vote or where their polling place is? And so we thought it was really important to set the record straight, but also to call on this company and all companies to do right by voters. This is about the voters. This is centering them in the discussion. They have to have the most accurate information over the next 84 days.
What does success look like to you on this front? Because I suspect you're clear on the fact that Elon Musk's not going to call you up or write to you tomorrow and say, you're totally right, Secretary Simon, I'm going to stop doing this.
Well, our suggestion, as you alluded to in that letter, was do as another chatbot did. ChatGPT agreed to shuttle or transfer users to the canivote.org website when asked about elections questions. And we think that's a modest and reasonable thing to suggest that the X chatbot do as well. You already have one major player doing it. They wouldn't be blazing a new trail. They wouldn't be the pioneer here. Someone else is already doing it. They should do something like that too, so that there's no confusion. We can set the record straight and that voters get the most accurate information.
We need a lot of people to turn out in this election because we should have 100% of voters turn out in every election, and that's what you and other secretaries of state do. We do have an issue with poll workers in large case because so many of them are threatened by it. This used to be the most benign, amazing thing to do as a public service, but now you and a lot of other secretaries are suggesting that you're going to be short of people to do that in a world where Jocelyn Benson, the Secretary of State in Michigan, was swatted. Poll workers are being threatened. We've seen this for years. How do you fix this?
I would point out it isn't just Secretary Benson this week that was swatted twice, as I understand it, but the Secretary of State of Vermont, Sarah Copeland-Hanses, was also swatted or had an attempted swat. Yeah, it's a problem. We don't want threats. We don't want harassment. We don't want intimidation. One thing that we have done in Minnesota just this year is we've basically outlawed doxing of election judges. We call our poll workers election judges in the state. But whoever works the polls, and not just them, but the people who administer elections the other 364 days out of the year, they deserve some minimum sense of privacy. And they deserve these shields and these protections. This is but one that will make sure that they can just do their jobs. That's all we ask, that they be allowed to do their jobs.
I think that, unfortunately, a lot of people on the left have leaned into this by trying to categorize people by skin color and then give special benefits or special amounts of discrimination. The Harris administration, for example, handed out farm benefits to people based on skin color. I think that's disgraceful. I don't think we should say you get farm benefits if you're a black farmer, you don't get farm benefits if you're a white farmer. All farmers, we want to thrive.
That's Donald Trump's running mate trying to tell us that he doesn't see color, except those black farmers he's complaining about don't have that luxury. For like a century, black farmers have been blocked from accessing federal subsidies, debt forgiveness, and other programs that have been a lifeline for white farmers. J.D. Vance is lying to you when he says white farmers don't get benefits. Under Trump, just 0.1% or $20 million of pandemic relief funding went to black farmers. The rest of the $26 billion went to white farmers. The racial disparity was so egregious that just 2 weeks ago, the Biden administration did indeed begin distributing $2 billion to thousands of black farmers who had previously been denied. Republicans like Vance and Trump advisor Stephen Miller, who is tangentially connected to Project 2025, have made it a point to block these disbursements. In Project 2025, folks like Miller, Vance, and Trump want to nationalize their long-term goal of putting a stop to what they call anti-white racism, which is just another way of saying we're sick of America being held accountable for actual racism. Under Project 2025, the Department of Justice would play the central role in executing their national policy of reversing racial progress. They would force the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, which is responsible for enforcing federal statutes that prohibit discrimination based on race, color, or religion, or sex, disability, or national origin, to refocus, moving away from what they call affirmative discrimination and ensure, quote, lawfulness, which essentially means protecting the people who've had access and opportunity all along. Joining me now is Michael Harriot, columnist for The Grio and host of the Grio Daily podcast, and someone who has read the whole 900-some-odd page Project 2025. So talk to us about this idea of reversing the federal civil rights administration to serve the people who've always been served in America?
Yeah, so one of the things that Project 2025 wants to do, and I want to be clear about it because not only did I read the entire Project 2025, I read Agenda 47 and pointed out that Project 2025 is essentially a instruction manual for Agenda 47. So both things reflect these issues. And what they want to do is remove the Civil Rights Division of every federal department. People don't know that, the Department of Housing and Urban Development has a Civil Rights Department, Department of Education. And so what they want to do is eliminate these, and they want to refocus on basically anti-white, anti-Christian, and that's the important part, anti-Christian discrimination. So, for instance, if you allow your employers allow their employees to have insurance that allows them access to abortion or reproductive health care, that is discrimination against Christians in under Project 2025. And there's a whole litany of anti-LGBTQ, anti-Black, anti-everything but white Christians sprinkled throughout Project 2025.
And so the idea, I guess, basically is that the federal government's role, which has been corrective in the 20th century, trying to shore up the rights of Black folks, brown folks, LGBTQ people, women, they're saying, no, that's wrong. We have to go back to having the federal government serve only white Christians, or at least to make them give them preference or give them preferential treatment.
The interesting thing is that, first of all, there really aren't that many race-specific programs in America. Right? So what they want to do essentially is continue the discrimination, not just, remain stagnant, but continue the discrimination and erase any progress. They want to not just stop the fixing of the problem, right? They want to revert back to the eras when we ignored the problem. And that's a lot of what's contained in Project 2025. There's a section on the Department of Defense, right, that talks about the military. And it says it wants the military to stop essentially being woke. And it uses those words, woke, right?
Yeah.
And revert to the demographics that reflected the country in 1974. Now, if you didn't know this, there is this whole right-wing conspiracy that the military is getting too non-white, right? Like there are too many Black officers, there are too many Hispanic officers. And so they want, when they say pre-1974 demographics, what they're talking about is when the draft was legal and the military was white. And so they use those kinds of code words that you kind of have to decipher through this right-wing propaganda, because they have right-wing propagandists who wrote this basically white manifesto.
Yeah, let's play J.D. Vance, who's on the side of all of this. And here he is talking about the Civil Rights Act.
And if you understand what the Civil Rights Act was aiming to do and then what it did, and you compare them, it's kind of insane when you actually just put it in like, when I realized this, the light bulb went off. This is what I realized. The United States passed a law that said you're not allowed to discriminate against people based on the color of their skin. And the bureaucracy that was set up to enforce that law has forced private and public sector entities to discriminate against people based on the color of their skin.
So for J.D. Vance to fix that, Project 2025 would remove terms like diversity, equity, and inclusion from all federal rules, regulations, contracts, grants, and legislation, end SNAP, which feeds hungry people, end student loan forgiveness and increase monthly payments, end the program that requires federal contractors to comply with anti-discrimination laws so they could discriminate, overhaul Minority Business Development Agency, meaning no more grants and loans to minority businesses of color, overhaul public housing, enforce work requirements, enforce the death penalty more vigorously, terminate any unnecessary consent decrees, meaning police agencies that have been found to disproportionately kill people of color. Thoughts?
Right. And the most interesting thing about it is they want to eliminate this idea called disparate impact, right? That says, like, you don't have to be, use the N-word or just intentionally mean to discriminate, right? The impact of a policy is what makes them racist. But they want to eliminate that. And they have this stuff sprinkled all through Project 2025 that intentionally targets non-Black and non-white. Well, everybody who's not white and not Christian.
There you go. Michael Harriot, my friend, thank you very much.
Amy, you are someone who served this country. What do you make of these attacks on Tim Walz, his record, and how he's responded?
Yeah, well, what was not played there was that J.D. Vance also attacked Governor Walz by saying that he somehow dropped out of the military in order to not go to Iraq. And all of this stuff is just, it's so outrageous. And those of us, first of all, as a post 9/11 vet, to myself, to watch another post 9/11 vet denigrate somebody who served 24 years, it just hurts to watch. But on top of that, you know, what Governor Walz did today was he acted exactly the way a former command sergeant major would act, in a way that was honorable. He basically said, look, J.D. Vance served honorably, and I'm proud of my service as well. J.D. Vance, on the other hand, is acting juvenile. I mean, that's basically what he's doing, and attacking somebody else's service. It makes me sad as a veteran. But at the same time, remember, he's part of the Trump world. Trump was the one who attacked John McCain. Trump was the one who started attacking Gold Star families. And J.D. Vance is just falling in line with what Donald Trump has been doing for years. No longer is the Republican Party that follows this the party of patriotism and the party of veterans when they attack veterans this blatantly.
Stuart, put emotions aside, right? From a political strategy standpoint, do these attacks on Tim Walz's record, to Donald Trump going on and on about her crowd sizes, lying about AI, how does that serve their campaign? How does that win them votes?
Well, it's not winning them votes. They're losing votes. You know, Trump has always had this fundamental problem in this race. He lost by 7 million. He needs new customers. So what is he doing to get these new customers? He's doing nothing. And I think what we're seeing now is, and I've seen this before in campaigns, when a candidate thinks that they have won, which Trump clearly did when they went into that convention, and then it's pulled away, that takes a lot of emotional maturity to deal with. And emotional maturity is something that Trump has absolutely zero amount of. So what this campaign is really an extension, exactly as Amy was saying, an extension of Donald Trump. An angry guy. He picked an angry guy in J.D. Vance, who's kind of mad at the world, mad at where the world is going, afraid of the future. And I just don't think that this is very appealing. Usually the most optimistic candidate wins. You want to feel better about voting for someone. And I think you see that in these crowds and how people have come to them. There's being part of this process is helping people, making people feel like they're helping others and helping the country. And that's a good feeling. It's not an angry feeling.
Okay, Stuart, I want you to stay on that because you've run campaigns. If you were inside the Trump campaign right now, if you were running it, what would your reaction to be? I mean, tonight I saw Nikki Haley on conservative media, and she said independent voters like Kamala Harris because she brings hope. She's talking about freedom and a way forward. We do not want a former president talking about the past. If Nikki Haley, who actually has a lot of sway with independent or moderate Republicans, and has endorsed Donald Trump, is on television saying Trump is doing the wrong thing, what's happening inside Trump HQ tonight?
You know, just as a note, I think it's fascinating that for a couple of years, the conventional wisdom in politics was that one of the problems President Biden has is that people think he might not have gone the distance, and then you would end up with Vice President Harris as president. So it just shows how wrong the conventional wisdom is, because now she's exploded on the scene. You know, all you have to do is look at the text that was prepared for Donald Trump to give us his acceptance speech. That's the document that says where the campaign thought they should be going. And then compare that to the speech that he actually gave. I mean, dissertations are going to be written about this. Trump couldn't stay on his own speech text for 10 minutes. And then his sort of like inner Trumpism came out. And this isn't going to change. 79-year-old men do not change. And that's the problem you have inside that campaign. You can sit in that room and you can come up with the best ideas, but the execution of this is always going to falter because it comes down to Donald Trump, and Donald Trump is just such a flawed candidate and flawed human being.